The Byte Show is listener-supported at thebyteshow.com. The Byte Show is sponsored by Deep Cello Coffee, perhaps the best coffee on this or any other planet. The Byte Show is sponsored by Deep Cello Coffee, perhaps the best coffee on this or any other planet. The Byte Show is listener-supported.
Hello, everybody. This is GeorgeAnn Hughes, and this is The Byte Show. And tonight, we are going to enter Part 15 of Cosmic War with our one and only Joseph P. Farrell. Dr. Farrell is a brilliant and gifted researcher and author. He's authored many books. And, golly, Joseph, you've got your plate full.
Yeah, I do. I sure do.
Yes. And also, we'd like to extend a warm hello to the Soviet Union.
Russia, the Soviet Union's not anymore.
Well, Russia.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, Russia. They are large fans of Dr. Farrell's writings, and we're going to start tonight by sort of the Planet X idea. The Earth, says one paleontologist in perfect and elegant Portuguese, faced this threat before, and all life was nearly exterminated. The rogue threat is a killer asteroid.
Right.
Now, Joseph, how realistic is this happening? Would this be to happening again?
Well, that's a good question, and just to kind of give folks an idea of where you're coming from with that, you're citing the very beginning of the Cosmic War, where I have this kind of fictional scenario of the various world powers being confronted with the reality of an asteroid possibly striking the Earth. And the thinking is, the reason I get into that scenario is because if you have watched TV lately, in the last 5 to 6 years, the Discovery Channel, the History Channel, the Learning Channel, and so on and so forth have had these programs about killer asteroids hitting the Earth, okay?
Yes.
And the basic standard theory within academia is that approximately 65 million years ago, there was such an event, a large asteroid hit the Earth, and as a result of throwing up all that dust and energy and so on and so forth, the dinosaurs were wiped out and the climate of the Earth changed, and then we have the rise of the mammals and so on and so forth. Okay? And there is a school of thought in contemporary academics that this is something that, given all the junk floating in outer space, that eventually a similar event could happen again, all right? Now, I have my suspicions that this is, in a certain sense, but a ploy that is being created to weaponize outer space for other reasons. Follow me?
Yes.
The other reasons being that there are certain groups down here that suspect that we have relatives out there that aren't too nice and may be coming back, to put it as bluntly as possible.
Oh, my.
And, we'd better have the means to defend ourselves, and the way to do that, of course, if you can blow up asteroids with weapons that you put into outer space, well, then you can pretty well take care of anybody that may be coming along. And I think there's another possible agenda as well, and that is to place essentially a weapon that is capable of blowing up a planetoid is also something that you can use to strike anywhere on the surface of the Earth, too. So in other words, I think some of this is just basically a ploy to allow certain people to put weapons in outer space, or to justify the fact that they already have, which is probably the case, which is probably the case. Now, there is another school of thought that there is a so-called Planet X out there. Sitchin calls it Nibiru.
Yes.
And I want to deal specifically with Sitchin's scenario, because I've said many times that I am not a Sitchinite, that I have some problems with many aspects of the scenario that he constructs in his books. Well, one of the main themes of his book is precisely this Planet X, or Planet Nibiru, which he says, passes through the solar system every 3,600 years or so.
Mm-hmm.
And quite simply, my problem with his version of this theory is that the physical mechanics simply does not work.
Yeah.
If something like that were truly a hidden or lost planet in the solar system, we would see some sort of signatures in the orbits of the planets that we do not, in my opinion, see. All right.
Okay.
So I want to be very clear that when I entertain thoughts or notions of Planet X or something of that nature possibly striking the Earth, I am not talking about Zecharia Sitchin's scenario or his version of it. So, but a good question nonetheless, because it gets us into the whole idea of really why there is this push to put weapons powerful enough to defend the Earth from a possible asteroid strike.
Yes.
And the reason I mention all of this is because in my books I've mentioned repeatedly a physical, astronomical thing called the Roche limit, R-O-C-H-E. And if you want to think of it, it is a kind of a natural defensive grid around a planet that's caused by its gravitational field, that when an object enters it, it is subjected to tidal stresses and in many cases breaks up. The Roche limit essentially is a barrier that crunches stuff up and makes it manageable.
Yes.
Well, if you remember, you saw a good example of the Roche limit at work when the comet Schumacher-Levy a few years back broke up and then struck Jupiter. So in other words, the whole comet didn't strike Jupiter. It was fragments of it because it was subjected to all those tidal stresses by Jupiter's gravitational field. So, I have my doubts about killer asteroids and so on and so forth for that reason as well. It would have to be a very big asteroid traveling rather quickly in order to strike a blow like that on planet Earth. So, I've got problems with the physics of it, and then I think, as I said in the beginning of my remarks, I think that a lot of this is just nothing but pure politics and a way to create a smokescreen to get weapons up into outer space for other reasons.
Yes, for other reasons.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, Bode's law.
Bode's
law.
Bode's law.
Yes. He talks about the spacing of the planets.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that significant?
Well, Bode's law, Bode was a German astronomer, 18th century German astronomer, who came up with a law, a very simple little arithmetical law that I mentioned in the first chapter of the Cosmic War, that predicted relatively successfully the orbits of the planets, beginning with Mercury, out through the known planets back then. But the problem with the law was that it predicted a planet should be in the asteroid belt, and there wasn't any. Okay? And at the time that he made his prediction that there should be a planet there, of course, astronomers began to look for one. And unfortunately, what they were finding, what eventually they started to find, of course, were the asteroids. They found, I believe it was an asteroid by the name of Charon. I may be mistaken about that, but the asteroids began to be discovered because they were looking for a planet where the asteroid belt is.
Yeah.
That's the problem. And as soon as they discovered that, well, what we're finding here isn't a planet, we're finding a bunch of junk, a bunch of debris, they came to the conclusion very, very early in the 19th century that this debris that they kept finding was probably the remains of an exploded planet. That's where the whole idea of an exploded planet started, was Bode's law and that prediction. And oddly enough, GeorgeAnn, these early 19th century astronomers, guess what they named the planet? Krypton. So in other words, yeah,
Krypton.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about the asteroid belt and this idea of an exploded planet, which is, you know, the early 19th century version of it, is, and I should qualify that by saying that it was serious astronomers that were talking about an exploded planet. So in other words, you know, this wasn't sort of 19th century New Age nonsense going on. These were very serious astronomers trying to figure out, well, why, you know, did this astronomical law successfully make a prediction, and all we find is a bunch of junk and no planet? Well, they came to the conclusion that there was a planet, and for some reason it blew up. Now, it should be noted that there's a lot of asteroids, and they're solid. So in other words, whatever blew up was a large, solid planet. That's the key.
Oh. Well, Van Flandern claims that asteroids exhibit explosion signatures.
Yes. Let me give a bit of background. Dr. Thomas Van Flandern was the modern astronomer in the 20th century that revived the exploded planet hypothesis for a number of reasons. The first and most important was he was trying to explain the origin of comets, because the standard theory, which if you study astronomy for the origin of comets, and to me this is a gas. I mean, this this makes no sense whatsoever, but this is actually the standard theory, that way out beyond the orbit of Pluto there is a belt of space junk that is called the Oort cloud, all right?
Yeah.
And astronomy, this is actually the standard view in astronomy, incidentally. So in order to explain the origin and wildly erratic, eccentric orbits of comets, astronomers have come up with this idea of the Oort cloud, which is this belt of space junk out beyond the orbit of Pluto, to explain the origin of comets. And this, what they say is the cause of it is, occasionally a passing star will, by virtue of its gravitational fields, kick a bunch of this debris into these wildly eccentric orbits that we see comets possess, okay?
Yeah.
Well, you know, stars don't just wander around and kick debris into wild orbits. This is kind of my basic problem with the whole theory, you know. Well, it turned out that Dr. Van Flandern, a very serious astronomer at the U.S. Naval Observatory, had the same problem. The physics just doesn't work. So he revived the idea of the exploded planet hypothesis to explain why comets even exist and have these wild, long, elliptical, erratic orbits, okay? And he plugged a bunch of cometary orbits into a mathematical calculating program and ran it backwards to figure out if, in fact, these orbits would come from a common place of an exploded planet in the asteroid belt. And lo and behold, the results fell out statistically that, yes, there were two essential times that a planet may have exploded that kicked a bunch of this debris into cometary orbits, and that was 65 million years ago, and then about 3.2 million years ago, and then all harmonics thereof, okay?
Okay.
And, you know, I get into some of the other reasons that he had for those two dates in the book, but in answer to the asteroid question then, if you look at some of the asteroids, which he did, he notes that some of these asteroids are diamond possessing. They possess diamonds in them. And this is an interesting thing because, of course, diamonds are only produced under tremendous heat and tremendous pressure.
Yes.
Okay? And the only way on Earth that you get diamonds is simply because of the large mass of the Earth. In other words, if there are diamonds in asteroids, then they came from a large, solid planet that blew up.
Oh.
Yeah, oh-ho. So this is exactly what he formulated. He wrote a book called Dark Matter, Missing Planets, and New Comets, I believe is the title of it. And he outlines, in several hundred pages, his case for the exploded planet hypothesis. And, of course, I jump off in the cosmic war there, because he, having outlined this hypothesis, then to explain the orbit of comets, which he does successfully, the next problem is, well, why did the planet blow up?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Which is, we'd kind of like to know, since we're living on one.
Yeah, it would be a handy thing to know.
It would be a handy thing to know, because we certainly don't want planet Earth to blow up.
Right.
Well, he proposed several models to explain why the planet blew up. And the first was a nuclear fission model, okay? In other words, basically kind of an atom bomb model of naturally radioactive materials gathering into a critical mass in the solid core of the planet and blowing up. The problem is, on a standard fission model of splitting an atom, you don't get anywhere near enough energy out of the explosion to blow up a planet, okay? That's the first problem. So then his second model was, okay, well, that's one model. Here's another one for why the planet blew up. He posits that somehow a bunch of antimatter got collected in the core of the planet and was separated somehow from matter, but somehow it came into contact with matter, and of course an antimatter-matter reaction is a total annihilation reaction, and it caused a colossal explosion and the planet blew up.
Yeah.
Well, as I pointed out in the Cosmic War, the whole problem with that theory is that while antimatter does exist, I mean, they've actually created this stuff, it exists in such minute quantities vis-a-vis matter that many physicists doubt whether or not the relationship between matter in the universe and antimatter in the universe is symmetrical. In other words, they doubt whether or not there's ever going to be enough antimatter around to worry about. Okay?
Uh-huh.
So that's the next problem with Van Flanderen's model as to why this planet exploded. So when you read Van Flanderen, and I take the reader in the Cosmic War on a kind of a thorough review of his book, you can kind of sense his frustration of trying to explain why in the name of sense did this thing blow up.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And so finally he comes down you have to read him very carefully, but the final model that he comes down to is, well, if none of these models work, and you can tell he's not very happy with them,
yeah.
If none of these models work, then perhaps it was the result of deliberate action. In other words, what he's telling you is that somebody had the technology to push a button and do it.
Oh.
In other words, he's telling you it was a result of an act of war.
Wow.
And that is exactly what you see in the ancient texts.
Yes. Well, another thing that's interesting, Joseph, is that most comets originate from a point beyond the planetary solar system.
Well, yes and no. I mean, their orbits go out wildly out beyond the solar system, but the fact is they are still part of the planetary system of the solar system. This is the problem. If you say that they originate from outside the solar system, then you're getting into the whole Oort cloud nonsense, which, again, as a model, I simply don't accept.
Yeah.
But, what he's saying is that the force of the explosion itself kicked these things way, way out on these long, long orbits outside of the solar system.
Well, what about Mars and Xenon 129? Yeah.
Okay, well, that's a Pandora's box.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's an interesting problem because you know our good friend Richard Hoagland, and in his book, The Monuments of Mars, one of the things that he noted was that there is an unusual amount of xenon-129 on the planet Mars. Okay? Now, just so your listeners know the significance of that, xenon-129 is a byproduct of nuclear explosions. Okay? Yeah. In other words, light off an A-bomb and you're going to get a lot of xenon-129 floating around, okay? Yeah. Well, the problem is there's so much xenon-129 on Mars, abnormally high trace amounts of it. And since the origin of xenon-129 is most often in nuclear explosions, this leads one to the conclusion that, well, we have a bunch of A-bombs going off on Mars, okay? Yeah. Well, it's an interesting argument because, it's another argument that Hoagland makes for the case that there was a civilization of some sort on Mars and that all of a sudden it was destroyed. Because the other thing that he does in the Monuments of Mars, does quite a lot of in the Monuments of Mars, is that he looks at craters on Mars, crater counts on Mars. And oddly enough, just as on the Moon, there are all sorts of craters that are aligned in double systems. Crater, over and over and over and over again. Yes. And these, incidentally, are shallow craters. Mm-hmm. And the significance of that is if you have craters created by a meteoric impact, then the crater is going to be relatively deep, right? Mm-hmm. And it's going to kick up all sorts of ejecta and so on and so forth and create these, just think of that big meteorite crater down in Arizona. Yeah. It's huge. Yes. And you can clearly see how much junk was kicked up. Well, if you light off a nuclear bomb, most often those things are if you use them in war, they're actually exploded above the target in the air. Yes. And the reason for that is the bomb itself, you want to use the explosions, the waves from the explosion to create a pattern of interference on the ground so that the wave itself is more destructive, okay? So in other words, a nuclear bomb, when it's set off, is usually set off in the atmosphere above the target. And even on the target, it doesn't make that much of a crater. So the thing that Hoagland notices in his crater counts on Mars, looking at all these weird little double craters, is that they're also shallow. Yes. Which is a signature, again, of a nuclear weapon rather than a meteoric impact. So in other words, you pile all this up, GeorgeAnn, the fact that one hemisphere of Mars was suddenly brutally concussed with this shockwave of water. Mm-hmm. The fact that you have abnormally high trace amounts of xenon-129 in Mars, in its atmosphere. The fact that you have this consistent and repeated pattern of double cratering in all of these weird alignments on the surface of Mars and so on and so forth. Well, add all that together, and what he's saying, and I think would probably now agree with, is that you're looking at yet more signatures of this ancient cosmic war and the exploded planet. And I mention that shockwave of water because this is very significant in Van Flander's hypothesis. Because in his estimation, the planet that exploded was probably water-bearing, okay? Okay. And probably more massive than the Earth, just given the amount of junk, that we see in the asteroid belt. And he hints around in the book that it is this sudden shockwave of water concussing Mars and then later the Earth, that this may account for the origin of the flood. The universal earthly traditions are all over the globe that there was a big flood at some point. Well, to me, it's very interesting, GeorgeAnn, that if you look at the evidence for the flood being on a planetary scale, as most people take the biblical flood to be, if you look for evidence of the flood on a planetary scale, the planet that shows the most and best evidence for a planetary-wide flood isn't planet Earth, it's Mars.
Oh my gosh.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Oh.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you know, in photos that I've seen of Mars, you can see what I would describe as water having had carved out.
Oh yes.
Certain things.
Oh yes, you're absolutely right. This is something that puzzles exogeologists or planetary geologists about Mars, because as I say, the southern hemisphere of Mars looks like it was just absolutely scoured all of a sudden with a huge amount of water that just more or less slapped the planet, scoured out all of these gorges and chasms. I mean, there are places on Mars that absolutely dwarf the Grand Canyon in scale and size and depth and so on and so forth. And the northern hemisphere of Mars, conversely, is almost devoid of any of that sort of evidence of geological flooding, okay?
Yeah.
And in Van Flander's reading of the exploded planet hypothesis, what happened was, and the other thing we should know is that Mars has virtually no magnetic field, no magnetosphere, as does the Earth. Mm-hmm. It's very, very weak on Mars. And of course, you know, the atmosphere and everything else on Mars is quite different than Earth. But there is enough evidence to suggest that Mars may have once been a life-bearing planet with oceans, continents, and so on and so forth.
Yes.
So in Van Flander's reading of it, what he suggests, kind of hints around at, is that when the planet exploded and you had this shock wave of water and debris spreading out from it, the first planet that it's going to hit, of course, is going to be Mars. Okay? Mm-hmm. Mars is concussed, and that shock wave basically strips away or creates such a shock that the magnetosphere of Mars is stripped away. The atmosphere of Mars is blown away, basically, whatever it was, and you have this now barren planet as a result of it. So, yeah, it's a very complex hypothesis. The problem now that we revisionists have to face that is a significant one is that in Van Flander's dating, as I mentioned, this event took place either 65 million years ago or 3.2 million years ago, all right? Mm-hmm. The ruins on Mars in the Cydonia region that Hoagland has been talking about for so many years appear to be much younger than 3.2 million years ago.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah. So we have to do one of two things. We either have to look at our chronology for this event, or we have to assume that whatever civilization was on Mars took some sort of steps to ensure its survival, or that whoever was on that planet had some of its people escape prior to the event and then come back.
Yeah.
Okay? Now, I mention that because in several of our previous interviews, you have mentioned the ancient text that speaks of the gods leaving the earth before the flood and then looking on from the meridian of high heaven, right?
Yes.
And weeping.
Yes.
Okay?
At the destruction.
At the destruction that has been caused. Well, again, there is really nothing in the story to indicate that we have to assume that it is planet Earth that they're escaping from.
That's true.
It may be, again, because the geological evidence for a planetary-wide flood is much better on Mars than on Earth. It may be that the whole story is taking place somewhere else, namely there.
Oh, my goodness.
Oh, my goodness, yeah. You see, this opens up a really big Pandora's box because, again, if, you know, let's just speculate here a bit. Let's assume that it's Mars that the biblical story of the flood and the Babylonian Atrahasis epic, you know, their version of the flood story, and so on and so forth. Let's just assume that it is planet Mars on which the flood takes place. Okay? What's the ark? Well, in a certain sense, it makes a lot more sense to assume that the Ark isn't a big boat that you've stuffed a bunch of animals into and that you have to clean up their poop. Okay?
True.
Let me be very blunt.
True.
If we're dealing with a society, if we're dealing with a civilization that has an interplanetary capability, that has that kind of science, it is also likely, if you take those ancient texts seriously again and look at all the little suggestions and clues within them, that they had a very sophisticated genetic engineering technology, it is equally possible that the Ark may have been some sort of spaceship and the samples of animals, so to speak, nothing but DNA cultures, collections, okay? Which makes a lot more sense, and it's a lot easier to store, if you can clone something.
Yeah.
Okay? Now, the reason I suggest that scenario is, if you'll recall in the Cosmic War, I mentioned certain Native American Indian traditions. And incidentally, the Dogon tribe in Africa and the Zulus in Africa are adamant that they don't come from this planet.
Yes.
They come from an island across the sea. And again, if you know how to decode the text, oftentimes those ancient texts will call deep space the ocean.
Yeah.
Or the sea, or the abyss, or the primeval waters, or what have you. That's their name for outer space. Okay?
Yeah.
And what are islands? Well, they're planets.
Yes.
They're little spots of land in the midst of a vast ocean, right?
Okay.
You see, so in other words, learn how to decode the text, and if you decode them in that way, then what they're talking about is, so to speak, an interplanetary exodus, if I can be blunt, of survivors that may have come from there to here.
Well, it makes sense. It really does. Especially the part of carrying DNA of animals and not having to clean up the poop and feed them.
Exactly.
To carry food for animals would be...
the biblical story and the other stories are telling you something very significant. But it's important not to take it too literally, and get visions of big boats with, covered in pitch and all sorts of animals crammed into it.
Yeah.
It's telling you something very significant. It's telling you, number one, there was an elite at work that saw catastrophe coming and took steps to ensure the survival of life.
Yes.
Okay? But if you look at it in that way, that's all it need to tell you. And if you compare it, more importantly, to other cultures' versions of the flood, they're saying essentially the same thing. But again, like I have said so many times before in these interviews, these stories are they're deliberately designed, in my opinion, to operate on a multiplicity of levels.
Yes.
To indicate, number one, there was a flood on Earth, and probably we got a bunch of people into a boat just to survive. Okay, sure, that's the prosaic level at which we understand the story.
Yes.
But at a much deeper level, when you go back to the fact that in these ancient texts, their word for space, outer space, is the abyss, is primeval waters, is the ocean, is the deep sea, and so on and so forth, then looked at in that way, you are dealing with a story of cosmic war and resulting catastrophe, and they did something to ensure their survival. That's what you're looking at.
Yeah. Well, the gods. We have throwing thunderbolts around.
Yes. Well, I know where you're going.
Yeah. The squatter man.
Yes.
Of the Native American Indians that's recorded in petroglyphs.
Yes.
Is analogous to three-dimensional plasma.
Yes.
Stability.
Yes.
Yeah.
That, I'm so glad you brought that up, because that raises a whole other data set of points that supports this whole cosmic war hypothesis. The fellow that you're talking about that did that,
Anthony Pratt.
Anthony Pratt, right? He is a world-famous plasma physicist. Now, here's the thing, folks.
Oh, dear, more.
Oh, yeah, oh, dear, more. This guy was studying these petroglyphs. And now, mind you, folks, we're talking about a man who published all of this in a scientific peer-reviewed journal, okay? So, in other words, we're not dealing again with some New Age fly-by-night that's channeling information from Ra, okay?
Right.
We're dealing with a PhD in plasma physics.
Yeah.
Well, he looks at these petroglyphs that you're talking about. I reproduce them in the book.
Yes.
And he does a three-dimensional rotation of them. In other words, he models them not as two-dimensional objects, but as a three-dimensional object around a common axis of rotation. And what do you get when you do that? You get a picture of what's called plasma pinch, okay?
Okay.
And I reproduce photos of some of these plasma pinches in the Cosmic War, okay? And what he says is, at some point, apparently, very, very ancient man saw massive coronal plasma displays in outer space and reproduced them in these petroglyphs, all right?
Okay. Yes.
Now, the really interesting thing is if you go all the way over to Mesopotamia once again, you get pictures, and I put the picture of this in the Cosmic War, of the god Ninurta, and some think it's actually the god Nergal, but whoever, and some even think it's the god Marduk, okay? Doesn't matter. Some Babylonian Sumerian god, okay? Yes. There's a picture of him, and he's holding in his right arm, he has his right arm up above his head like he's throwing a spear, okay?
Yeah.
But instead of a spear, what he's holding is a depiction of the divine thunderbolt, okay? And if you look at this thunderbolt carefully and then look at the picture of the plasma pinch that I have in the Cosmic War to compare it with, lo and behold, they look almost identical.
Oh, my gosh.
All right? So in other words, there is an element of scientific truth, this is the point, to the artistic depiction that you see from ancient times of the gods throwing their thunderbolts. Now, let's go back to Mars. Okay? On the surface of Mars, right near the equator, there is a huge, gigantic, almost planetary-wide scar that runs for thousands of miles. This is the Martian Grand Canyon, and like I say, it absolutely dwarfs anything on planet Earth for its sheer scale.
Yeah.
But the odd thing is, number one, if you look at the geology of this feature, it's called the Valle Marineris, okay? If you look at the geology of this feature, it looks as if it had been carved out by a gigantic lightning strike. In other words, a plasma. That's all lightning is. It's an electrified gas. What you see when lightning goes off is the ionized atmosphere of the Earth as this huge amount of electrostatic direct current voltage is passing through it. Okay, that's what creates the lightning. It's the atmosphere that you're seeing glowing under ionization. Well, that means that essentially in that pattern where the electricity is running, that is a plasma.
Yes.
Okay? That's what it does. And when lightning strikes on the surface of the Earth, every now and then you can go out and find these little things called fulgurite on the ground. When lightning strikes on planet Earth, what it does, the lightning is actually rotating. It's spinning. The electrical current is spinning, okay? And when it impacts with the Earth, it creates a little whirl in the surface of the Earth. And if you look at the Valle Marineris, there's actually a rill on the moon called the Hyginus Rill, where instead of being carved by water or running liquid of some sort, you can look at it and clearly see that this is the result of massive, massive lightning strikes. So in other words, again, the science is confirming what the ancient texts are telling you.
Well, do these lightning strikes have anything to do with like a coronal mass ejection?
They can, yes. They can, because let's go back to what we discussed in the previous section about the templates and longitudinal pulses and so on, and pulsars. Remember that?
Yes.
Okay. If you recall, I said that any large rotating mass is a natural resonator of these kinds of physical fields, right?
Mm-hmm.
The sun is the most massive of all of those, correct? All it would take for gigantic lightning strikes from the sun is if somehow you polarized the sun and the planets in a huge electrical dipole, a huge electrical circuit, and that would create the conditions for those types of things that you're describing. And incidentally, there is a certain school, it's not a very well-known school within astronomical science, that maintains that in its original condition, very early in its history, the solar system was much more electrodynamic than it is now. In other words, that's their fancy way for telling you that now the planets are more or less electrically neutral. You don't get these big, huge arcs of electricity arcing from one planet to another.
Oh.
But what they're saying is way back when, the conditions may have been such that they could do that.
Oh, dear.
Oh, dear. Now, let's imagine if you possess the knowledge of all of that, if you possess the science to do it deliberately.
Oh, gosh.
Oh, gosh. And, of course, I'm maintaining that at one time we did.
Yes, yes.
And that we're trying to put it desperately back together.
Well, someone on the Earth had to witness some of these things.
Yes, well,
there had to be someone here to make the petroglyphs, to do the...
Yes, or to record stories about the wars of the gods tossing their thunderbolts.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
Now, again, Peratt is a peer review, the paper that he published where he says all this is peer-reviewed. It's a serious scientific paper. Mm-hmm. The problem is, again, the chronological one. Because, again, if you go back to Van Flanneren's hypothesis, the hypothesis states that the planet exploded either 65 million years ago or 3.2 million years ago. I opt for the later date, about 3.2 million years ago, for various reasons that I get into in the Cosmic War.
Yeah.
But if you take the petroglyphs that Peratt is talking about, those, if I recall correctly, are dated to approximately 30,000 to 45,000 years ago, right? So in other words, again, the chronology is the problem. It's not the basic facts that are the problem. It's the chronology. Trying to piece all of this together in a consistent chronological framework. Now, I don't attempt in the Cosmic War to reconcile all of these chronological difficulties, but I'll speculate a bit here on one possible way to do it. And that is that if you recall, in the Cosmic War, this war between the gods appears to have been fought at least in two stages. In other words, we have sort of an ancient version of World War I, and then, Germany comes back and we get to go round two.
Yeah.
So, let's hope the old phrase, third time is a charm, it's going to be the case. But the same thing holds true if you read carefully these ancient texts describing the Cosmic War, because there's an early one fought between Marduk and Tiamat, right?
Yes.
Then there's a later one fought between Ninurta and Nergal.
And it's interesting that I think the first time the Earth was destroyed by fire.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So, the problem I see, or the way I will speculate now as a possible way to reconcile some of these chronological difficulties, is I've always maintained, and I do so at the very beginning in the introduction to the Cosmic War, that these two factions, whatever they were, that fought those wars, that they have more or less continued to fight them underground since then. So in other words, what we may be looking at with some of those petroglyphs is the ongoing conflict, so to speak, between them. So that at least, that's my thinking now. And the reason I'm putting it to you that way, GeorgeAnn, is because in the book that's at the printer now, Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men, I outline a case, or I begin to start the case of what happened after the Cosmic War. What were the surviving elites up to? And again, you know, we know part of the story from Babylon's banksters of what some of them were up to.
Oh my gosh.
But you know, I'm trying to fill in the blanks. In other words, in Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men, to a certain extent, as to what were the first steps that these surviving elites took after this war. So, in other words, I'm continuing the story, and it's part of my model as I continue this story to assume that you have essentially two surviving ideologies, the good one and the bad one.
Yeah.
Okay? The good one wants to bring humanity up from the dust and rubble of that war back to a state of harmonious development and a similar state of civilized development and infrastructure and so on. Okay? The bad one wants to get back to that level of civilization too, solely for the purpose of reconstructing all of those destructive technologies and being able to lord it over everybody else.
Yeah, kind of like a military-industrial complex.
Yeah, the Mesopotamian military-industrial complex. That's precisely what we're dealing with. Okay.
Oh my gosh.
In other words, you know, if you think of the Apocalypse of St. John, you know, the great whore Babylon the Great has fallen, and everybody weeps because they're not able to trade with her anymore. Yada yada yada. Well, to me, that is a system.
Oh yes.
It is a system of thinking, it is a system of culture, it is a system of science, and it's, most importantly, all of this technology, okay?
Yeah.
That's what the conflict is between, are these two brotherhoods. And I put it that way because, again, if you go to occult tradition, if you go to esoteric tradition, over and over and over and over, the further back you go, the more you hear about the Brotherhood of Light and the Brotherhood of Darkness.
Oh, yes.
Or the Society or Secret Society of Agartha and then Shambhala. You know, whatever you want to call it, it is there in almost every version of occult or esoterica that you can think of, from the Hindu all the way to the medieval Western, okay?
Yes.
And I think, again, that what they're trying to tell us is something very significant, that you had both tendencies survived that cosmic war. Both tendencies had elites that represented them. And most importantly, let's go to Babylon's banksters for a moment and remember something that I said at the very beginning of that. If you recall, I said that the real founding purpose of the Bilderberg Group was to take all that Nazi loot that Martin Bormann and company are sitting on top of and move it into the Western banks, where they would be kept off the books, that pile of cash would in turn allow those banks to expand their ledger credit-making entry ability and hence create the post-war boom, all right?
Yes.
In return for which the Nazis had all of their money laundered and could funnel it back into their projects. Follow me?
Yes.
That was the real purpose of the Bilderberg meetings when they started. It was to create this détente between the surviving bad elite, the Nazis, and the surviving good elite, the Anglo-American corporate people, all right?
Yeah.
The Rockefeller-Rothschild crowd.
Yes.
Now, let's go back to the Cosmic War. The same circumstance prevails. You have just fought an immensely destructive war, and essentially it left both sides exhausted.
Yes.
So what do the surviving elites do? For a while, just as after World War II, they make common cause.
Aha.
Aha.
Yes.
That's why the story is so muddied.
Yes.
Both after World War II and after the Cosmic War. There's the other source for the editing of texts that we keep bumping into, because it's impossible, if you assume that model to be true, to say that this family of texts represents the good guys, namely the biblical, and that set of texts, namely the Mesopotamian or Egyptian or Hindu or what have you, represent the bad guys.
Yeah.
Because they're all in it together.
Oh my gosh, Joseph.
Uh-huh.
What chance does the little guy have?
Well,
oh.
I think a great chance, because we are witnessing more and more people waking up to the fact that all of these stories that they have been taught to believe implicitly
Yes.
contain problems.
Yeah.
The real problem for, so to speak, what you're calling the little guy, is that they don't know where to look, and they are afraid to voice the questions that they have. Because the teachers in the universities and the professors in the universities haven't a clue. And if they do have a clue, they're not going to talk about it.
Oh, yeah. They'd lose their tenure.
They'd lose their tenure.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, the rabbis and priests and pastors haven't a clue. Their job is to perpetuate the same old story and the same old answers.
Yeah.
Okay? So, again, I think we're looking at a huge, 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 very, very old problem with these stories. And it goes back to this cosmic war and the fact that you had two tendencies survive and represent themselves in elites.
Yes.
That's the real origin, in my opinion, these surviving elites. These are the origin of the mystery schools. They're the origin of the ancient priesthoods. They're the origin of those secret societies that were attached to them, and so on and so forth. All of this is fallout from that cosmic war.
Boy. Well, you know, even, I mean, so much of this is suppressed. Even the Christian fathers gave
Yes.
ancient testimony of the existence of giants.
Oh, yes, they did.
Augustine
Yes.
believed that mankind was once enormously larger and
Yes.
long-lived.
Yes.
The Roman legions,
Yes.
they battled giant soldiers.
Yes.
Pliny the Elder wrote one giant was over 40 feet tall.
Yeah.
Giants were found among the Celts.
Yes.
You know, these things have been suppressed.
Well, and the reason why is they don't want you looking at them too closely.
And in Ginsberg's Legends of the Jews, Abraham was 20 feet tall.
Yeah. Yes. That's another little tradition, you know, that we don't like to hear of, they don't want you to hear about.
Yeah.
But yes, all of these things are true. Now, I get into the evidences for giants and how the ancients most likely misinterpreted a lot of it in Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men. You know me. I lay something out there, and then I'll write another book about it.
Yes, yes.
But the reason I did that is to get people to start thinking. If you're coming from a planet with a larger mass than the Earth, and it's solid, what kind of people are you going to have?
Larger.
Larger. Why? Because they're going to have much more massive bones and so on and so forth, because of simply the gravitational structure. You know, it's going to produce that. In one argument, you can look at it the other way and say, well, you're going to have much smaller, shorter, fatter people too, you know, for the same reason. But, you know, the whole point is to point out all of this that is arguing little details that point in the direction that this exploded planet hypothesis is in fact true, because it correlates so nicely. It makes sense of all of these ancient texts and myths. And what it's telling you is that they're not myth in the sense of being untrue.
Yeah.
They're myth in the sense of containing a core of truth.
Yes. Well, the pre-Adamic world was destroyed by fire and then by water in Noetic times. Could we entertain that is true?
Well, again, the traditions that speak of the pre-Adamic world and its destruction, you know, are there's Jewish traditions to this effect. And oddly enough, if you come all the way across the Atlantic Ocean and go visit the Maya, they have, they have similar traditions.
Yeah.
You know, and how does an academic explain that?
Yeah.
They really can't, and they're not even really inclined to try and explain any of that. But the problem there is, again, when you're reconstructing the history of this, and this is one of the big problems I have with Sitchin. You can sit down and read Sitchin, and he's got a detailed chronology of all of this, but you can only derive that detailed chronology by selecting certain things and ignoring others.
Oh, okay.
Okay?
Yeah.
So in other words, in the Cosmic War, I'm not trying at all. I even come right out in the introduction and tell you that there are so many chronological problems, so many points in the data set that you have to deal with, such as this business of Hebrew traditions of the pre-Adamic world being destroyed by fire.
Yes.
Okay? Where do you fit that in this scheme of the Cosmic War? Now, having said that, in a certain sense, you can fit it rather neatly, because if you view the rise of modern man, which occurred, according to the geneticists, about 150 to 200,000 years ago.
Yeah.
Bang! All of a sudden, we have Cro-Magnon man popping up, and if you read the standard evolutionary explanations for it, they make no sense. We're just all of a sudden here.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, and very quickly we decide that we don't want to be hunter-gatherers anymore. We want to, we want to create these big civilizations.
Yeah.
And again, this makes no sense. They ignore these things and try and fit it into some kooky evolutionary scheme about how all these civilizations came out. And in the end, they end up not explaining it at all.
Yes.
So the problem is, where do we come from? Well, if there was a pre-Adamic world, if there was a pre-Adamic civilization, then that can be fitted into this cosmic war scenario precisely by all of these divine thunderbolts being cast around.
Yeah.
Because what is a plasma? It's a very, very hot gas.
Yeah.
It's a fire. It's like the sun. So there you go. So you can have all sorts of explanations, but you know, I'm going into this detail to try and show people how to go about, if you're going to go about coming up with a chronology of these events, then you have to work very carefully, and you have to pin it around a very broad framework. And to my mind, that broad framework of chronological progression is provided by Van Flanderen's exploded planet hypothesis.
Boy.
Because there you have an arguable, hard scientific case that can be made for the dating of certain things at certain times.
Yes, yes. Well, another thing, the gods seem to have agreed to starve the people to death.
Yes.
Oh.
Well, yeah. In the Babylonian version of the flood, it's called the Atrahasis epic. Okay, Atrahasis is their name for their Noah character. Okay.
Yeah.
In that version of the story, you read about the fact, and this to me, GeorgeAnn, is really where you begin to see the clues that there are agendas going on behind the texts.
Yes.
Particularly the biblical text, all right?
Yeah.
Because what's the story in the biblical text with Noah? Well, he's the only righteous man around, and we're going to save him and liquidate in good Yahweh fashion, we're going to liquidate everybody else, you know, which raises just enormous moral problems for me, you know. Yeah. But anyway, in the Atrahasis epic, you get a very different take on the reasoning behind the flood. And that is that the gods, and the two gods, incidentally, that are fighting the most are Enlil, our good old friends Enlil and Enki.
Yeah.
The law and order guy being Enlil, kind of like a Mesopotamian Joseph Stalin, you know.
Yes.
Yes. And Enki, equally mischievous, kind of, you know, the god of chaos and all of this sort of stuff, you know, kind of like a Mesopotamian Adolf Hitler, you know.
Oh gosh.
So you're dealing with those two gods, and they're sitting around debating what are we going to do about man, because in the epic, the gods complain that the noise made by their own creation, and let's remember that in those texts, they're very clear that modern man is a chimerical created creature, the offspring of some pre-existing hominid on Earth, and then a mingling with their own DNA.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
So in other words, we are a genetically engineered species according to those texts.
Yeah.
All right? Well, having created us as slaves to them to ease their burden of work, they'd soon discover that we are propagating like rabbits.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
And you know, human libido being what human libido is. So in other words, what they're really afraid of is that there's so many of us, they're going to lose their power.
Uh-huh.
That's the thing. So Enlil's first little nasty thing to get rid of us is to starve us to death.
Yeah.
You know, to withhold food.
Well, and what are they talking about today?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Food
you know,
shortages, prices rising beyond.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's, you know, same old. Been here before, been there, done that.
Yeah.
So, you know.
Gee.
But, you know, the starvation plan isn't working fast enough and is apparently not going well enough, getting rid of enough humans for these gods to be satisfied with, so Enlil decides to wipe us out by a flood.
Yeah.
Okay? And that's when Enki steps in and subverts the whole process by telling Atrahasis, you know, they're going to wipe you out with a flood, so, you know, build a boat and save yourself and some of your friends. Okay?
Yeah.
So this is this is what goes on.
Well, the flood was arranged.
In any version, this is an important point that you just hit on, GeorgeAnn.
Okay.
In any version of the legend of the flood that you consult, be it biblical, Sumerian, Babylonian, Mayan, North American Indian, in any version that you consult, it is an arranged event.
Yeah.
In other words, it is the product of political calculation and a technology that can do it.
Oh my.
That's the key thing.
Yikes. What's changed?
Yes, what's changed?
The position of the stars of heaven changed, and I did not return them to their place.
Yes.
The control of heaven was undone.
Yes.
What about that?
Okay, let's go back to the whole cosmic war hypothesis. Okay? Let's go back to the exploded planet.
Okay.
Do you remember in the Giza Death Star destroyed, I cite the Enuma Elish, okay?
Yes.
And at the very end of what I cite, it says, and Marduk measured the structure of the deep.
Yes.
Okay? Why is that necessary? What's he doing? Well, the whole technology that we're dealing with, GeorgeAnn, is based on what? It's based on planetary positions and celestial alignments, right?
Yes.
If you blow up a planet, That's going to throw a major monkey wrench into the celestial mechanics of the solar system, needless to say, you know. And incidentally, there are even more interesting things in the Babylonian text, because Tiamat had her own zodiac system, okay? And if you read the Babylonian text, what does Marduk do? He comes along and he throws all that out, and he introduces essentially the system that we use now, okay? Mm-hmm. So in other words, it looks to me that what's going on is, because as a result of the war, you've altered the celestial mechanics of the solar system. You may have knocked a few of the planets off their axis of rotation 1 or 2 degrees, and as a result of that, that's going to change the measurement of all the stars and so on and so forth, right?
Yes, yes.
And their positionings. So in other words, once again, what the texts are telling you is something colossal happened in the solar system, and everything had to be redone.
Oh, my gosh.
Now, incidentally, this is where I pick up the story in Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men, is with the story of what is the first thing the surviving elites did after the war. They measured everything.
Yeah. Well, the galactic meaning of the flat Earth, the 4 corners of the Earth.
Mm-hmm.
What is that all about?
Okay. In all of these ancient symbols that we've heard, like the 4 corners of the Earth or the 4 winds and so on and so forth, all of these things, again, are code for a deep physics. That's the point. So, in other words, let's go to Hoagland's favorite thing. The circumscribed spherical tetrahedron, right?
Yeah.
Where you take a 4-pointed, 4-sided tetrahedron, you put it inside of a sphere, so that the points or the vertices of the tetrahedron touch the surface of the sphere, okay?
Okay.
What do you got? You've got 4 corners.
Yeah.
You've got, in other words, a little code telling you that the most fundamental platonic solid has 4 corners, and that spheres rotate that structure somehow and transduce energy from it. That's what they're telling you. The same thing holds true of all rotating systems. They have all got these little tetrahedral mathematical expressions, including the galaxy.
Oh my gosh.
So in other words, again, when you read in an ancient text, like the Edda, the Norse myth, when you read about grinding of Hamlet's Mill, and actually that's the name of a book, a very famous book called Hamlet's Mill, by some very respected scientists.
Yes.
That look at ancient texts as codes for this physics. Mm-hmm. So in other words, I'm not even the one that invented it. It was a professor from Harvard or MIT, or I forget which one it was. But in other words, all of this stuff is coded physics. Every last shred of it. And that's what the 4 corners of the Earth means, or the 4 winds, and so on and so forth, that you sometimes see expressed in Mesopotamian literature.
Oh, boy.
And 7 winds, too, incidentally. Why? Why 7?
Why 7?
It's a tetrahedral number.
Oh, boy.
Oh, there we are again.
Yeah, that's true.
That's true. That's right.
Boy.
Uh-huh.
Well, these elites, mm-hmm. they even made biological weapons, meaning scorpion men, fish men, and weather weapons, invisibility, oh gosh.
Yeah, all of this stuff is being borne out by modern science.
Yes.
All of it.
They are currently, I guess it was last year, England gave the okay for the scientists to create whatever they wanted.
Yeah. Well, you knew that was going to happen.
And they call them manimals.
Yes, I know.
Gee.
I know, which is interesting. Because if you go back, there is, after Alexander the Great conquered his empire, after he died, he divided it into 4 parts. And each of his major generals took control of one of these parts. The Ptolemies took control of Egypt. The Seleucids took control of Babylon, okay?
Okay.
The so-called Seleucid Empire. Well, that general, in turn, turned around, and incidentally, they did the same thing in Egypt. These generals commissioned the priests of their territories to put into Greek a history of their land, of their country, okay? In Egypt, the task fell to a fellow by the name of Manetho. This is where we get the Egyptian kings list, as a result of this official history that these generals wanted drawn up.
Yes.
Okay? In Babylon, the fellow's name was a priest by the name of Beresus, okay? Mm-hmm. And he wrote a 3-volume history called the Babylonaica, all right?
Yeah.
Now, most of that history is lost to us.
Oh, yeah.
But it survives in fragments that are quoted in, of all people, Eusebius, the church historian.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, who cites them in his ecclesiastical history. So you can actually sit down and read quotations from this lost Babylonian history, all right? Mm-hmm. In that history, Beresus says precisely the same thing, that at a very, very ancient period, you had all of these chimerical creatures, including, interestingly enough, the idea that mankind himself was once a masculine androgynous creature.
Wow.
Wow.
Yeah,
wow.
Because daughters weren't born to them until later.
Until later, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And you find the same thing in Jewish tradition.
Oh, my gosh.
So, in other words, we're looking, and the fact that it comes in later in the Jewish tradition, to me, is probably a legacy of the Babylonian captivity, where they learned these stories and were attempting, in my opinion, to fit them into their own religious context.
Yeah.
Because, again, let's assume that we're Jews of the 6th century. Mm-hmm. And we go into exile into Babylon. Well, we've got our religious books, right?
Yes.
And all of a sudden we encounter a culture with the same stories, but more details to them.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
So what do? We try to make sense out of our own tradition by incorporating into our traditions some of these stories and Hebraicize them.
Yes.
So in other words, I think with some of these things in the Jewish tradition, you're looking at second-hand or second-generation Babylonian stuff.
Oh, yes.
You see, the story gets more and more and more complex.
Yeah.
This is why, if you're going to go back and do a revisionist history of this period of time and incorporate the biblical text, you need to move very slowly and very carefully.
Yes. True. Oh. Well, the weapons that they came up with tap into space and time.
Yes.
The medium itself, Joseph.
Yes.
Good grief.
Yeah, good grief.
Oh. It's mind-boggling.
Yes, it is.
The expanse of time that we would be looking at. Oh my gosh.
Well, let's since you're talking about expanse of time.
Yeah.
Let's put this again into the modern context. When I make comparisons of what happened after the Cosmic War with these surviving elites, and what happened after World War I and World War II with the Allies and Germany, the comparison is not accidental, GeorgeAnn. Because what happens after World War I? The Allies prohibit, in the Treaty of Versailles, prohibit Germany from even really having an effective defense at all.
Yeah.
Now, put yourself in the Germans' shoes for a moment. Here they are, sitting squat in the middle of Central Europe, And they are surrounded by powerful countries.
Oh, yes.
France, England, Italy, Russia, okay?
Yeah.
No self-respecting German politician or military man is going to settle for that state of affairs.
True.
Their national survival depends on an effective defense.
Well, of course.
Of course. So no sooner is the ink dry on the Treaty of Versailles, and the Germans are plotting and planning on how to get around. Forget about the Nazis. This was being done by the Weimar Republic, all right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, one of the things that happens in Germany after World War I is that the elites of the country, the corporate elites, the military elite, and so on and so forth, because of the stipulations of the treaty, what did they do? They went underground.
Oh,
and
yeah.
what did they do? It's after World War I that you see a burst of creation of secret societies,
Yes.
of hidden elites that are, number one, trying to preserve a technological and scientific legacy that was uniquely German. And number two, as a result of this conservation activity, they are also secretly, quietly steering policy behind the scenes.
Oh.
So in other words, let me put it very bluntly. I think that you have represented in 20th century history, particularly in Europe, and the activities that go on in association with the two major world wars, that you have evident activity of the survival of those elites from the cosmic war, that far back.
Oh, my gosh, Joseph.
Why else, GeorgeAnn?
Oh.
Why else do you find the beginnings of a secret space program and a public one in Nazi Germany?
Oh.
With rockets
Yeah.
raining down on London in a very visible display of an antiquated technology. While over here, secretly and quietly, what are they working on? Flying saucers, the bell, and all of this horrendous stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh.
Oh,
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, yeah. And, you know, the same thing occurs after World War II in the Soviet Union. You've got rockets, and then you've got Kozyrev off over here doing his little thing.
Yeah.
We don't even find out about it until 40 years later, you know.
Oh, my gosh.
Yes, exactly. This is a very, very big story, and it's a very old one. And, you know, my model, GeorgeAnn, is that, yeah, I am really proposing that these two brotherhoods or elites or whatever you want to call them have survived for that long.
Clear back to
the end of that cosmic war. Yes, ma'am.
Oh, my.
Because if you stop and think, what am I doing with Babylon's banksters? I'm filling in a little part of the history of what they're up to after that war.
Yeah.
If you go look at the Philosopher's Stone, I'm filling in the Middle Ages a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
With the Nazi books, I'm filling in the modern period. So, you know, I've still got gaps to fill in. Certainly.
Yeah.
Big, huge ones. Gaping ones. But, in other words, the model has worked so far, it hasn't let me down.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah, it's a big story.
Well, the Enuma Elish is an account of war, not a creation epic.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm glad you raised that, because if you go to a seminary, for example, and a fairly liberal one, you might be exposed to some of these Mesopotamian traditions and myths, right?
Yes.
And the Enuma Elish is one of them that sometimes you're exposed to. Well, they teach you in universities and seminaries, well, this is a creation epic.
Yeah.
Because what do you have? You have creation emerging from the primordial chaos, right?
Yeah.
Well, if you sit down and read the danged thing, it's not a creation story at all. It's the story of a war, a real, honest-to-goodness, actual war. And if you read the details, particularly in the fourth tablet of the Enuma Elish, incidentally, there were 7 tablets, instead of 7 days, 7 tablets. Okay,
Yeah.
and that's that had contributed to a certain extent that the academics back in the 19th century, when they discovered these stories, that's the reason they thought they were looking at the Sumerian version of Genesis. Okay,
Yeah.
but it has nothing whatsoever, nothing at all to do with creation. It's got everything to do with this war of the gods, because the details in the 4th tablet of the destruction of Tiamat are describing in detail the destruction of a planet, and doing so with the detailed physics signatures that you would see if you were dealing with the kind of physics that we've been talking about in this series.
Oh my gosh, Joseph. Oh.
Yeah, it's big.
Yeah, it's huge.
It's gigantic.
Yeah, that's
It's
right.
gigantic. And if all of this is true, GeorgeAnn, this is the significant thing. If all of this, and italicize, boldface, and underline the word if, okay? Because I'm certainly not presenting any of this as just hard dogmatic fact. It's my considered opinion.
Yes.
But nothing more. If all of this be true, then it has a profound effect on the way we should interpret modern events and who is behind them and
Absolutely. Absolutely, Joseph. Well, going back that long ago, who was present on the earth? The sons of heaven,
Yes.
the B'nai Elohim,
Yes.
the sons of God,
Mhm.
the Anunnaki.
Mhm.
Gosh. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, and I don't obviously don't discount those stories. I believe them. I believe that we're not dealing with some sort of theological pious pie in the sky stuff that has to be explained away in little Sunday school lectures. I think that we are dealing with a hard fact and reality.
Well,
and incidentally, hold on to your thought.
Okay.
Because I want to add this. For the kind of genetic engineering to take place, as is indicated in those ancient texts, there has to be an initial genetic compatibility to begin with.
Oh, yes.
So in other words, my friends, what we're looking at with these Anunnaki or B'nai Elohim or what have you, what we're looking at in terms of the implications of modern genetic science is we're looking at our genetic cousins out there somewhere. In other words, the species Homo sapiens sapiens is part of the genus Homo sapiens, right?
Yes.
There are other members of that family. That's the other implication of those ancient texts. And they're out there somewhere.
Yeah.
Out there somewhere.
And MIT, several years ago, there was a science program on television, and MIT was presenting foreign objects that had been extracted from the human body.
Yes.
And they claimed that they were implants of some type.
Yes.
There are numerous agencies that make the same claims.
Yes, yes, yes. Well, that whole technology of cybernetic implants and so on, is something I touch on in Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men. We do not need E.T. to explain that technology. Absolutely do not. The technology publicly in the record goes back to the 1950s to a psychologist and a medical doctor by the name of Dr. Jose Delgado, all right?
Yes.
A name I'm sure you're familiar with.
Yes.
And, you know, in a very famous demonstration of what he could do with his implants, he stepped into a bull ring in Spain. He was a Spanish doctor. he stepped into a bull ring in Spain, and he had already implanted one of these, 1950s clunky things in the bull's brain.
Yeah.
And, of course, the bull charged at him.
Yeah.
And Delgado just stood there very calmly. He had this little remote control thing in his hand. And as the bull got closer, he simply pressed a button, and the bull stopped dead in its tracks.
Oh.
Just stood there.
Yeah.
Okay? That's with 1950s technology.
Well, back then, around the same era, in mental institutions, they had implanted pleasure devices.
Yes, exactly, yes.
And they learned that the wearer of this kind of implant would burn out the pleasure center of their brain.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, it is possible. And, these mind manipulation techniques and mind control technologies I get into in a very interesting context, incidentally, in Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men. Because if you're familiar with it, and then you go back and look at ancient texts, particularly those claiming revelation as their authority.
Yes.
Okay? Some sort of special revelation. What it looks to me that you're dealing with, again, is a technique of mind manipulation, of social engineering, to be very blunt.
Yeah.
In the name of religion. And you're looking at, in some cases, I think, a leftover technology from that high civilization. Oh, yeah. And again, I'm putting all of this out there as speculation, because people, particularly of religious inclination, need to be aware that if these technologies existed back then, if we're arguing and accepting this whole cosmic war, ancient civilization hypothesis, and if we accept that hypothesis as a basis for looking at things, then we have to understand that if these technologies exist, they imply massive changes in the way we look at some very familiar texts.
Yes.
And what's going on in them.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Now, they're not too pleasant, and I leave it for people of religious inclination to figure out an apologetic response. That's not my intention in these books, is to lay out what's called a theodicy, a systematic explanation for evil and its existence and so on and so forth. I'm simply laying things out there for people's consideration. But it does raise massive, massive, massive issues for any sort of religious apologetics, be it Christian or Jewish or Muslim, what have you.
Yes.
Because all of those religions are, to a certain extent, affected by some of these conclusions, if they be true.
Oh, Joseph, you've done it again. Listen, everybody. Joseph has a website, and on his website there is a PayPal button, and I would appreciate if the listeners would wear out that PayPal button. He needs support. He's recently moved, and please.
I want to, if I can, I want to say something here. The move was, as you know, very expensive.
Yes.
And it's questionable how long I'll be able to sustain my writing as a result of it, but it was, as you know, necessary for my safety. But I do want to thank those people who did make donations. I received one from a lady who I won't mention, but you know who you are, that I truly, truly do thank you, but I thank all of you that made donations. I'm about a third of the way to what I needed to get through this, so I want to thank those people that brought me there to that point, because it's truly, truly, truly appreciated, and God bless you all for doing that.
Well, go to the GizaDeathStar.com and make use of the PayPal button. This is GeorgeAnn Hughes with Joseph P. Farrell, Dr. Farrell, signing off tonight, and we hope to do many more of these exciting broadcasts. Okay. God bless everyone that's listening.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.
The Byte Show is sponsored by Deep Cello Coffee. Perhaps the best coffee on this or any other planet. The Byte Show is listener supported at thebyteshow.com.